Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Cultivate. I'm excited to be here with my fellow Associate Executive Minister, Reverend Paul Schneider. And this is a fun one. I was looking forward to doing this for a while. I was talking to Paul about wanting to do this, and we're going to talk about the hit show on Apple TV, Severance. But before we get into all of that, I want to say a couple of quick things. First off, we're going to try and not do spoilers, but I'm going to tell you, the people listening on the podcast or watching this on the video, is that you should have watched this already. So it's your fault if you get spoiled, okay? We're going to try and not do this. But Paul was trying to be gracious and saying, you know what you should do is just stop what you're doing. This video will be waiting for you. Go watch the show and then come back because it will enrich this episode. The other thing I want to talk about is we're going to talk about some really big things. We could probably make a whole podcast of this episode with many episodes within. So we're biting off a lot today. So we're just going to try and look at the mountain peaks and dive into little things here and there. The last thing I want to say is that this is not the first time that you and I have talked about pop culture. We did one when I was pastoring at JBC, at Japanese Baptist Church. We talked about midnight mass, and we talked about like all the theological implications and ramifications of it, and it was really fun. So I'm really excited to do this again with you, Paul. So before we dive into all of this, for those of you who are kind of confused as to why we're talking about this, I thought it would be nice for you to share a bit about why you think Christians should be interacting and engaging with pop culture.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I think is just a reality is that pop culture is the meaning-making stories, songs, items of culture that our society tells itself. There was a time in Western civilization as a whole where the Bible was foundational. And the meaning-making stories were very, very often based off of these biblical stories. And there was a great level of biblical fluency. That's not the society we live in today.
Right.
Not only has the Bible's stories become so backgrounded that, sure, they're still foundational, but they're not top of mind for people. But also just fewer people than ever are really interacting with Scripture. And instead, they're encountering these ideas in these other stories that our society is using to talk about meaning, talk about what does it mean to live? What does it mean to have a good life? What does it mean to fall in love? What are the implications of those things? So that's one reason why I think it's really important as Christians that we be interacting with pop culture is because this is actually how our society is talking to itself about the things that really matter.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, for those of the listeners who don't know, you're actually doing a whole dissertation on this with the Berkeley School of Theology. So you're doing your doctoral work on this as we speak. And why I totally agree with you on this is that this is not good nor bad, because culture, we can learn a lot of good stories, but there's also a lot of bad stories out there, right? That can actually be very harmful and toxic. And what some Christians will do is that because they're afraid of those stories, they just won't engage with them. But actually, as Christians, we need to be bold and say like, no, actually we can contribute to the dialogue. And in fact, we might have something really good to say that no one else can say. And so rather than kind of shying away from these stories, these TV shows, these comic books, we should actually lean into them and be humble partners with them, right? And to learn from them. So that's kind of what we want to do in this show today. Sorry, did you want to say more on that?
I just wanted to say, you know, the very first class that I took in seminary when I was working on my Master's of Divinity was a summer course called, so a week-long intensive, called How to Talk to Youth and Young People About God. And one of the things that the professor said in my very first class at seminary, which really stuck with me, was God created humans with culture. So very often in culture, we can find things that point back to God. And our society is no longer looking or aware of those things on the same level that committed Christians might be. And while there are many ways to interpret that, I think the Christian interpretation remains an important and valid one. And that's something that we can share in and engage in dialogue in ways that help us share our values and the things that make us committed followers of Jesus Christ.
Right. And I think that's a really wonderful way of putting it, is that we have something to say. There's something very valuable. And I don't know how it happened, but there is this kind of stream in very conservative Christian thought, is that there is this sort of purity of culture, and then everything from the world is just like tainted and evil, and so don't engage with it. But in doing so, we've made Christianity so irrelevant, so removed from what is actually happening in the world today. And so, a lot of what we're trying to even do very humbly in this episode is just to get back into engaging, right? So let's just dive into it.
Yeah,
we could
absolutely.
have. I have so much more to say what we talked about right before, but I'm going to be bold and brave to not get into it. Let's talk about Severance. So for those of you who don't know, I'm just going to do a very rough, unfair synopsis, but Severance is based on this whole idea that people, it's unclear if this is in the future or in the past, but it's just, there is this world where you can join this company called Lumen and elect to have a surgery where it will alter your brain so that you have your own life, persona, consciousness outside of work. But then when you get to the work building, you get in the elevator, go down into the basement, your consciousness shifts into what they call the innie, which is like inside the job. And then at the end of the day of work, you check out, and then you meet your outie, which is the one who lives in the outside world. And everything implied about that starts to take place. So that's kind of the center idea. It focuses around this office group. The aesthetic is really interesting. It's a very 1970s sort of like art brut, like just very austere kind of environment set in the Midwest.
They
Who knows where.
deliberately keep the office space kind of out of time.
Yes.
And for the same reason that there are no clocks in a casino.
That's right.
It's because then you lose track of when and where you are.
Yeah, that's right. And and just getting into this whole thing of like time and work, like there's this intention of like, if you can control perception of time, you can get productivity, right? That was my first experience. Is like I had this soundtrack gig in New York. I thought it was so cool. And they fed me lunch. They gave me a really good lunch. And I ate it. And I realized by the end of the day, because they fed me, it was good. I was there for like 13 hours or something like that, because I lost track of time. But I want to get into all of that in a moment. But I think the whole premise of this idea of any outie, there's so much to work with. It's very rich. And there are now like theological journals asking for submissions to talk about Severance. It has all these religious, historical, sociological implications. So we can go through all of them, but we're not going to have time. I think because we're a podcast of Evergreen, I thought a nice place to start, and then we can branch off from there, is that it's very clear that Lumen has ties to a religion. And it talks about this family, has a lot of like connections to like similarities to Scientology, Mormonism. They talk about praise cure, and this is how it guides the philosophy of the company. What do you think is going on here about having this connection with Lumen, the company, and religion? Your thoughts?
So one of the things that's immediately obvious when the show presents us with the innies, right, with the workers, is that they are people of limited experience.
Right.
And one of the best ways to get people of limited experience to buy into something is to present them with a worldview that is comprehensive, right? And so, and to some degree, because literally all they know is work. Because when they get in the elevator, the doors close, and then immediately the doors open again, and it's the next day, right? But to provide them with meaning, they give them the idea of these two competing kind of forces, right? There's the 9 core principles.
That's right.
And the 4 tempers.
Yeah.
And the 4 tempers are like bad things.
Yeah.
Things that the company doesn't want. And one of those is actually, in my opinion, not such a bad thing, right? The 4 tempers are woe, frolic, dread, and malice. And woe, dread, and malice. Woe is like sadness. Dread is fear. Malice is rage. But frolic is like silliness and joy. And I think that's actually a good thing. But I can see how a corporation would want to shape people to think of that as negative, right? Because that would take away from productivity.
Yeah, that's really interesting the way you phrased it, right? Because the key for this whole machine to work is that they need limited experience, right? And they need limited experience with a comprehensive worldview that gives them purpose. And when you're saying it like that, as an outsider, I can't help but think, like, isn't that what Christendom does when it's at its worst? It limits the experiences of people because that makes it easier to buy in. And then you have something that's comprehensive enough to like gather them all together. And so if anything threatens that limited worldview, right? Because like we're thinking about when Mark, as his brother-in-law, his like ridiculous self-help book comes in. But it's not a quality book, but it's something from the outside that just expands their experience a little. And they're just so freaked out about, like, we can see the permutations of like how it destroys the system. Because, and I think of churches is that we're scared of outside literature or like interfacing with other religions or pop culture like you're talking about, because it'll threaten the machine,
Right.
And we lose like things like productivity or like our end goal. But what's really scary about, I think, some churches is like they're not thinking about what machine have we created. Like it's kind of like, what is the end goal of this machine that we're doing?
Right.
And nothing's steering it. And if nothing's steering it, then very bad things can take over and start moving the machine. So I thought it was really interesting, right? Like how Lumen has so many interesting parallels to church, right? And then we were talking about the tempers, right? Like how many churches have we seen where we kind of talk about godly conduct, right? And like we need to resist like desires of the flesh, right? Doesn't it? It feels a lot like these tempers, right? And these core principles. It's like stick to these principles, but away from the tempers.
Yeah, I mean, the 9 core principles, many of them ascribe directly onto what are considered the 7 virtues. That's a largely Catholic idea, but it exists throughout Christianity. And so a bunch of them line up very directly. So I think that's really interesting. The 9 core principles are vision, verve, wit, cheer, humility, benevolence, nimbleness, probity, and wiles.
Interesting.
And some of those like humility and so on, they line up directly with, I mean, humility is one of those 7 Christian virtues, right? So, there's a direct lineup. For some of them, it's a little bit different. And like wiles, that's like cunning, right? That's like being able to see things as they really are and also to find your way around obstacles, which is really great for a corporate setting.
Yeah.
But I'm not necessarily sure that it's a virtue. Again, we're kind of running into this, like when you make a corporation a religion, how is that then going to shape the people who are inside it?
Right, shape the values. Right?
And one of the innies who's been in for the longest of the kind of the core group of 4 that we focus on, Irving, he's very much, he says things like praise Keir, like he reads those books religiously as an innie. And so I think that's really interesting that Lumen is in some ways co-opting religion in order to create people in the shape that they want them to be created in.
Yeah. And that's a great point to kind of like jump off of, because when I think about Severance as a whole, for me personally, I think the ultimate, if I zoom back really far back, like the ultimate theme that I think of when I think of Severance is about control. It's about control of identity, control of agency, right? And it happens on all these levels. It's about the people who volunteered for these jobs, like they're surrendering their control in a way to Lumen, but they're also trying to get control of their lives. Like Mark was going through this great tragedy, so he thought, if I can just like send myself to work every day, to get through the days, it's a way of like controlling and getting my life back, right? Lumen is controlling from above with this whole system. They are not just controlling them as employees, but basically like their whole being, we hear about when they act up, like they literally go to the break room to be broken and to get them to submit again to the rules. I think about how they also just control any thought. Like if people start thinking things, acting a certain way, they're called out.
And
punishments and rewards. Yeah.
No outside material is allowed in at all,
Yeah.
which is why that book, which is full of these like trite little sayings, something that would be considered laughable in the outside world becomes revolutionary to them because it gets them to think about themselves and their environment and their lives in a way that exists beyond 8 hours a day. I'm here sorting numbers.
Yeah, that's right. And then it gets to this existential thing. They really feel like, well, literally, if I get fired from my job, which would be the ultimate punishment, I literally die, right?
Right.
The innie dies. And so it's life and death. Like, what more control can you have when you're afraid of dying from these people?
For me, one of the most gratifying things about the second season was we find out that the religions of the world are reacting to this idea. And so we encounter a character who's Christian, who part of his reason for becoming a severed employee was that he'd lived a very harmful life up to a point, and then converted and was very concerned about not going to heaven and then being able to be with his partner. And so he and his partner agreed that he should become a severed employee because the innies were considered total innocents. And therefore, the soul of the innie would go to heaven, even if the rest of his soul did not. And that way there would still be a part of him where they could be together. And that was, that was explained to them by their priest in their tradition. And they were really thinking this through. And so I think that is fascinating that, and I really appreciated that the people who created Severance began to think like, what are the other implications of this? Do you have two different souls now living in one body because you kind of have two different people? Because frankly, if you took any of us and you stripped away all of our experiences, wouldn't we be, by definition, a different person?
Yeah, and that brings up that whole theological question that made Christianity really suffer, in my opinion, is that, we're indebted to Athens because we learned the structure of systematic theology through them, but we also imported a lot of things that were not from the Holy Scriptures. For instance, like this division of the body and the spirit, this dualism. The Gnostics really felt like, okay, there's when you die, all that matters is your soul, right? Your body is just like this dirty container, right? So you want to get away from it. Whereas like the Hebrew Scriptures are talking about how, we're like this integrated whole, right? And so that's why, we're talking about this whole thing when you're talking about that character thinking that somehow they can find salvation if they can just cut themselves into pieces. And I feel like the Hebrew Scriptures just says you can't, because, you can't be just, you can't just find like an innocent part of yourself. Like you're the whole being, right? Body, soul, there's no division. But I wonder if that's kind of what we do when we set up in some popular Christian culture, is that, hey, you can clean yourself up. You can make yourself look innocent and like put on the God show to get God's approval, and as a way of like taking your life back, like getting your salvation back through your own means, which is totally not what the gospel is about. And even when you're talking about the core principles, like it's interesting, right? You listed all those principles, but everyone in the entire series has broken them, right? From top to bottom, right? They can't live up to them. They all suffer from the tempers in some form, but they're all trying to, rather than like trying to figure out like, why am I acting up like this? They just try and cover it up so they won't get caught.
Well, because they're like little kids, right?
Yeah.
They're extremely limited in experience. At one point, one of the characters points out that she's only been alive for 107 hours.
Right.
She's keenly aware of that fact.
Yeah.
When we think about it, like the other characters, like a lot of them are like 2 to 5 years old. You know, one of the characters who, you know, retires, right? And that's where that question of like, aren't we killing his innie when he retires? Mm-hmm. He's like 12.
Yeah.
And in some ways they act like little kids, right?
Yeah.
Well, and the company buys them off with these kinds of rewards that would appeal to little kids. Let's have a dance party. Like here's a melon party, right? Here's your, you know, and so there's, you know, it's some of it is mocking the corporate culture where you've done a really good job. Instead of giving you a raise, everybody gets pizza.
Yeah.
But I think some of it is also really admitting that these are childlike beings in a lot of ways. Yeah. And so the same things that motivate kids, good food, let's have some fun, that motivates these people.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, right, going back to just paralleling it with Christian narrative, like there are some churches where we want to just keep them immature, like don't ask the questions, right? Like there's something that I would do when I was talking with just my church leaders is like, have you ever thought about like if you went to a church and you just look around, like, isn't this kind of crazy? Like we're singing songs, like we're praying and talking to things that aren't there. Like just that awareness, but there's almost this naivete that we just buy into things, you know, and just, and like when you're talking about the rewards, right? The melon, like we do these kind of ridiculous things and like we keep them not childlike, but childish, if you will, right? And, you know, you said it really well with all of those things. And I feel like bringing it back to pastoring in churches, I think it's a really sobering show to watch, to kind of call into question, what are the ways that actually we think we're helping these people with like giving them a narrative that gives them life, but are we perhaps controlling them or perhaps like stunting their growth, like you just said?
Yeah.
We're keeping them like as infants and we're not allowing people to grow up and to learn and to evolve into the identity that God's given them. And so, you know, it's a very entertaining show. Like it's visually amazing, but I feel like it raises so many key questions for people, especially who are in organized communities centered on a spirituality. I think you have to watch this show and ask those hard questions yourself. I think it's really important. Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really interesting is between the first and second season, there's this big event that happens at the end of the first season, and it sort of reshapes everything.
Yes.
And
we won't tell you, don't worry.
all of the innies, then when they come back, you know, to be employed, they're told that 5 months has passed.
Right.
But that's not really true.
Yeah.
They mess with their perception of time. And we kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think that there are churches out there that want to do the same thing. They want to lock themselves in time because they have a vision of a time when they feel like the world was best for the people in that church, right?
Right.
And they're not taking into account that kind of one of the only constants in the universe. This incredible universe that God created is change.
Yeah.
And that's true for people, that's true for cultures, and that's true for the world.
Yeah.
And when we want to instead lock ourselves in time, when we want to freeze people where they are, when we don't allow them to grow and change and develop and ask hard questions and struggle with doubt, we really freeze things, and then we have to keep everything childish.
Yeah.
Just to sort of maintain
That's right.
a veneer.
Yeah, that's right.
That makes people feel comfortable. But I don't think as Christians we're always supposed to be comfortable. I think a lot of times we're supposed to be hurt by the hurt we see in the world. I think we're supposed to be challenged by the things that we see out there that don't line up with that vision of on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah.
And what Lumen is doing with the severed employees and what some churches fall into, intentionally or not, even churches of good intent will fall into this pattern of feeding its people what Paul, the Apostle Paul, called like spiritual milk, right? Like implying like baby food, right? And we need to move beyond that.
Right. Absolutely. So many good thoughts. I want to talk about so much more, but I hope this is a good taste for just our listeners to say that there is so much powerful dialogue that can happen when we don't run away from the world, but run towards it and engage with it thoughtfully, because there's a lot of things happening right now that are just being unchecked, like undiscussed, unengaged, right? Disengaged. And we lose so much as a church if we don't engage with these things deeply. And so I'm very grateful for your participation in this discussion. I thought maybe before we go, I thought it's only fair, we need to talk about your shirt.
Ah, yes.
So I thought if maybe you could kind of just say a quick thing of like, why are you wearing this shirt today?
Sure. I call this my pop culture clergy shirt, right? This is the shirt that I wear when I'm kind of feeling in my clergy role and interacting with pop culture.
Right.
And that's because the character who's on this shirt is Nightcrawler from the X-Men.
Yeah.
And the reason why is that Nightcrawler is a priest. He's a person of faith who struggles to understand how his faith shapes his actions and the world around him. And he's a member of the X-Men, a group of people who are hated and feared because they not only look different, Nightcrawler looks very demonic, but they have these powers that are strange and people consider them unnatural. And so they're afraid of them.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that Nightcrawler looks fearsome, he is actually one of the gentlest souls among the X-Men, and he is a legitimate priest. He serves that role as confidant, as caretaker, and as spiritual advisor to many of his friends, including kind of one of the most popular X-Men, Logan. Wolverine is his very best friend, and the two of them, Nightcrawler is sometimes the only person who can talk Wolverine down. And so when I'm thinking about pop culture and when I'm engaging it in my role as clergy, this is the shirt that I prefer to wear. Nightcrawler is just one of my favorite superheroes, and it reminds me that spirituality and pop culture don't need to be separate. In fact, they're really the same thing. It's about telling and understanding, making meaning in different ways.
Yeah. We could easily do an episode on X-Men, God, and the marginalized. Easily. I mean, so we can make many episodes of it. So maybe in the future we will get around to that. Thank you so much, Paul, for your time. I appreciate it. And thank you for listening to Cultivate. We will see you next time. Make sure you like and subscribe. Feel free to reach out to us if there's something that you'd like to discuss or talk about. We'd be happy to do that. So we'll see you soon. Okay, bye.